Hello and welcome to Full Disclosure, a podcast project conceived entirely to let me spend more time with interesting people than I would ever get on the radio, and rarely has that description been more apt than it is in the case of Jon Ronson. Welcome.
Hey, hello.
It's lovely to see you. I sometimes, I don't know what you're like, I sometimes approach interviews ever so slightly conscious that we have to fill a whole hour. And I sometimes approach interviews thinking, how the hell are we going to confine our conversation to a single hour? You're very much in the second category.
Well, thank you. Well, I could bore for England about many things.
So we'll jump around a lot. I mean, I've interviewed you at length before on a different platform, but we'll return to some of the territory of what made you the man that you are. But it occurred to me, getting ready to sit down today, Jon, that you've got a sort of you've got a prescience. Your areas of interest have assumed extraordinary new levels of relevance after you've finished your explorations and your work.
I think, yeah. I mean, it's always like, I don't want to sound too egocentric.
No, of course.
But it's true. There's been a number of times in my career when I've written something and it's come out just before or just as other people got interested in it. So it happened with my book Them.
Yes.
About the which is really a book about, it's a sort of funny adventure story, but it's about the relationship between conspiracy theorists and political and religious extremists. At the time, no one was thinking about that. But that clearly became prescient. And one of the characters in the book is Alex Jones, who became the world's leading conspiracy theorist as well as presenter of the One Show. Just kidding. And then the same thing happened, I think, with the psychopath test, that I got interested in the relationship between psychopathy and corporate power. And the book came out just as other people were interested in it. And it happened again with So You've Been Publicly Shamed, about the kind of rise of what eventually became known as cancel culture.
It can't be a coincidence.
I don't know why. I don't know how I got lucky. I wish I could. Yeah, it's like that.
Because then you
old
know
line
what
about
to do
the Beatles. Yeah. I think it's. But there is something like, I think a lot of us, if we have a thought, we let it slip through our fingers. So I think it's a good idea, if you're in the kind of line of work that we are, that if you have a thought, write it down, don't let it slip through your fingers. And if it's interesting the next day, then maybe you're onto something.
And it must have something to do with how you look at the world. So if we were to find a common thread, it's looking at it's refusing to accept that anything is incomprehensible, that there must be reasons behind even the maddest behaviours.
Yeah, it's also mysteries.
Yes.
There's something about the world that I don't understand, and I want to understand it. So is it true that psychopaths rule the world? I mean, that book, The Psychopath Test, came about because a Harvard psychologist told me that you were 4 times more likely to have a psychopath at the top of the corporate or political ladder than at the bottom. And when I said that to a few, and this is now kind of thought of, but at the time it really wasn't. And I remember saying it to a few friends, like, did you know that you're 4 times more likely to have a psychopath as your boss than as your underling, if you have underlings? And they all said, oh yeah, it doesn't surprise me. And I got really annoyed because I was thinking, like, there's a particular mental disorder that's the worst mental disorder in the world, and that's the one we've chosen as a society to reward. So it's that too. It's like knowing when there's an amazing thought or an amazing mystery to be solved.
And I mean, you mentioned that these things have exploded in a way after you've completed your own inquiries, your own investigations. I know that another one that occurred to me, just reading the promotional material for the tour you're doing at the end of this year, which will be under the banner of the Psychopath book, about how we used to use diagnoses as a way of insulting and denigrating people, and now people are self-diagnosing and they've become defences against bullies rather than weapons for bullies.
Absolutely. It's another reason why I really like returning to the psychopath test every few years, because our relationship with both psychopathy and also with mental health labelling continually evolves. And yes, that's fascinating. This is the first time in the 15 years since I wrote this book that you have psychopath influencers on TikTok. There's a woman called Kanika in Australia who's she calls herself a diagnosed sociopath, but sociopath, psychopath, basically same thing.
Tomato.
Yeah, And she offers advice on how to successfully love bomb people and, manipulate them that way. And all the comments underneath are, "Oh, we love you, Kanika. Thank you for this lifestyle advice." So I've very mixed feelings about it. On the one hand, anything that destigmatizes any mental health condition is very positive. And we've seen enormous strides in autism being destigmatized lately, which I feel very positive about. But on the other hand, do we really want to be endorsing psychopathic values?
How many of these strands meet when we get to where American politics is now, where Donald Trump is now?
Oh, a lot.
Because you've got the Alex Jones, the extremist, big part of him.
Absolutely.
Obviously, you've got the questions about his own psychopathy.
Absolutely. And also the public shaming stuff.
Yeah.
I hate this term. I hate the term woke. But for want of a better phrase, woke overreach, the way that people were just being, torn to shreds on social media for minor transgressions. That's part of the reason why Trump got elected. It's kind of obvious. And so I think that book too, it speaks to the road that led to where we are now.
Maybe you should stop.
I mean, I got to say, like, all the things that I value in life, curiosity, the grey areas, the nuances, the fact that few people are monsters. I guess, some psychopaths are if they have no empathy. But most of us aren't. Most of us are a mix of positive and negative qualities. So all of these things that humanism over ideology, they've all become incredibly unfashionable now. All the things that I care about are really, I feel more and more like the old man on the battlefield, telling everyone to calm down before getting trampled by the horses.
So how does it crystallise then? So you write down an idea. How do you know? What sort of hairs on the back of your neck stand up when you think this is going to be my next big project?
It's a really good question. And it's definitely most often a kind of marathon, not a sprint.
Yeah.
Once in a while, there's been a sort of revelatory moment, a kind of light bulb moment. I remember cycling through West London and thinking, okay, if psychopaths rule the world, then what I should do is go on a psychopath spotting course, and then I'll journey into the corridors of power and try and spot psychopaths. And I thought, whatever happens is going to be good. And I had a similar moment with them where I thought, okay, if all these conspiracy theorists think that there's a shadowy cabal secretly ruling the world, I'll hook up with them and we'll travel the world and try and get into the secret room. Again, whatever happens is going to be good. But that only happens a couple of times in your life, I think, those perfect moments. Most of the time, it's a much slower process. It's like, okay, I've done these 2 stories that I didn't think would connect, but they do connect in this weird, interesting way. So I'm going to take that connection and see, so it's much more kind of a process a lot of the time.
Where do you think it begins? Where do you think the curiosity became sort of turbo powered? Was it always there? Because you're quite big on self-analysis as well, aren't you?
Yeah,
you quite like
maybe
to understand yourself.
Yeah, maybe a bit too big on it.
Right.
Like I'll talk about my own mental health issues, and then like when I'm back at the hotel, I'll think, what the fuck did I... So yeah, sometimes I'm too into self-analysis. I don't know, like there's something about 2 weeks ago, I was in Tennessee getting kicked out of this pool hall just after this guy. Like I met this guy and he was telling me the most amazing stuff. This is for an epilogue episode of a show I made a couple of years ago for Audible called The Debutante. It's going to be coming out very soon. I basically discovered something that motivated us to make a final epilogue episode. So I'm in this pool hall in Tennessee and there's a guy in the back room and he's got this big thing, which is either, in fairness, it's either a pool cue in a bag or a shotgun. I can't tell.
Yeah.
And this guy is telling me this revelatory stuff, like really huge stuff. And all the time his phone is like buzzing with text because the owners of the pool hall are watching on CCTV and they want me out. So the guy with the big thing is like, "Go, you gotta go, you gotta go." And the guy telling me this stuff, this revelatory stuff, going, "I'm sorry, you've got to leave. They want you out." And I left the pool hall and I was thinking, this is why I'm alive. Like, this is just, and I'm not like I'm not a thrill seeker. I'm
Sure.
not an adrenaline junkie, but because that was like an amazing moment in a story. I remember when I was a kid, there was a cameraman who filmed his own death. He's in a war and he films his own murder. And I really understand that because when you're in the middle of a story, you're just thinking about the story.
Well, except that you're not just chronicler, you're in it, you're inhabiting a story in a way that, some people would not want to do that.
Yes.
This distance that they keep, particularly foreign correspondence, war correspondence, is crucial to their own mental health. But you're the opposite. You want to be up to your ears in it, really.
Yeah, I kind of like
part of the story often as well.
Yeah, I found at first I was a little resistant to it because I thought, people are just going to get sick of me in all of my stories. But then when I started to try and take myself out, people were like, "Oh no, we like you in there." So I became at peace with it, and it's very good. It's very good for storytelling because it's your journey.
It is. Yes.
Yeah, I'm getting off a plane, I'm getting the rental car, I'm driving to this pool hall. The story started, so there's good practical reasons for doing it.
And
as well.
it straddles documentary and drama in a way, doesn't it? It hadn't occurred to me before. I've been fascinated. I don't know how closely you followed it from the States by the post office scandal being turned into an ITV drama,
right?
And the way that suddenly changed everything because it became a story about people rather than journalism or documentary. And it hadn't occurred to me before until you just answered my last question that in a way you managed to straddle both of those with the way that you do your work.
Yeah, well, it's certainly always sort of true.
Yes.
But yes, the idea of creating scenes, having a narrative, that I've always wanted to do that. I've always wanted to write books that people will read on beaches.
Yeah.
And I can only do nonfiction. I can't make stuff up. So
have you tried?
Only in screenplays. I
course.
co-wrote 2 screenplays that got made, Okja and Frank. But I've got to say, on both occasions, I felt a little out of my depth.
Really?
I was saying to somebody the other day, like if I'm on a Zoom about a piece of nonfiction, whether it's a book or a podcast, I'm king of the Zoom. Like I feel total confidence. I know exactly, like if somebody suggests something, I know instantly whether it's a good or a bad idea. If I'm on a Zoom about anything to do with fiction, like a screenplay, I'm the quietest person on the Zoom. I have no confidence about what's a good or bad idea. It's weird. You'd think the two things are quite similar, but in my brain, they're totally different.
That is odd because you would think that they sort of at least speak to similar things. I'm glad to hear you speak very positively about yourself. I'm glad to hear you say that I am brilliant at that.
I mean, I hope people don't think that's, again, like kind of egotistical.
Because that's the 3rd or 4th time that you've spoken in that about worrying about coming across of egotistical or even thinking that people wouldn't like you when you include yourself in your stories.
Yeah, that's weird that I'm...
Well, it's not, is it, when you think about your school days, your early life, when you sort of think about what horrible experiences you had. It's a miracle you got the confidence to do anything.
I know, it's amazing. Although the minute I left Cardiff and went to London, I was so... I mean, I left Cardiff, of course. My family still lived there, but I had such a terrible time at Cardiff High School. I was like the most bullied kid at the school. And so the minute I got to London, I was kind of like a coiled spring, just ready to go. Throughout my whole really bad time at Cardiff High, I always knew this would be over. Like this is a finite bad experience. The minute I get to London, everything's going to be okay, is what I thought, and it was.
That's a superpower, though.
It's very lucky.
Because you don't need me to tell you how some of these stories end. And the kind of bullying we're talking about is not your kind of Tom Brown schoolboy school days stuff. It's hideous and relentless and physical and psychological. I'm quoting you.
Yeah, no, it's true. It lasted, I'd say it lasted maybe about 3 years, and it was kind of every day for about 3 years. At a very, pivotal moment in your life when you're 15, 16. It was like a kind of agony. I remember. I'm sure there's some sort of psychological condition here that I'm describing, but I remember creating a sort of imaginary suit of armor around me, where nobody, like I put myself in a sort of imaginary bubble where nobody could get me. It was like some kind of survival mechanism.
It is. I mean, my therapist told me that's what I did when I was at school. And literally said that's what you've done. You've spent your whole life wearing this suit of armour that you had to put on when your headmaster started beating you when you were when you were 10 years old. But I mean, to have done it yourself in that way is extraordinary, isn't it?
It was, yeah. I kind of often wonder, just everything about school was so bad. Everything from the uniforms through to the kind of, I know we're in a room with big bright lighting here, but at least I'm allowed to wear a baseball cap.
Yeah, so you wouldn't be at school.
Yeah, exactly. So it's all...
So a sensory assault as well as a human assault.
Yeah, I've only recently come to realise that it was a sensory horror as much as a human horror.
I remember you telling me about being... I thought you might have been exaggerating when you were sort of blindfolded and tied up and thrown naked into the playground.
I wasn't totally naked.
Right,
but,
you had your pants on.
Yeah.
Right.
But otherwise,
But
that
still,
really did happen.
It's not much consolation. Well, I suppose it is quite a big deal in a sense, but all things are relative. And that, I suppose, to continue the theme of amateur psychology, trying to understand why those people did that to you.
I think so, yeah. I remember Caitlin Moran actually said that to me. She interviewed me like years ago, and that was her sort of analysis of me, that I've spent my life trying to work out, why people act like such dicks towards people.
Yes.
To try and understand what happened to me. And there may well be some truth in that. Definitely it's good training for a journalist being bullied at school.
and if I'd said to you in that period, in the sixth form, let's say, and I fully understand the sights are set on London. London assumes a quasi-mythical status as the place of deliverance as well as the beginning of the future. If I said to you, what do you want to be when you grow up or when you leave school, would you have said journalist?
No. I remember, actually, when I was in the Frank Sidebottom band...
These are the moments that are magical for people who don't know your full biography. Are they? When I was in from which you had to leave after he went bankrupt.
Yeah, exactly. I was fired for tax reasons.
This is when he stood up in court and said, "Can I pay it back at £1 a week, son?" Or something like, lad.
Would £1 a week suffice, Millard?
But we digress.
Yeah, but I remember the drummer, who was also the manager, Mike Doherty, said, "You're not going to be in the music business." He said, "You're going to end up being some kind of writer." And my immediate thought was, God, that sounds boring, because all I knew about writing then was reading Kurt Vonnegut talking about sitting alone in his room, smoking 60 Pall Mall every day. So I thought, that doesn't sound like a very good life. But it's definitely the life I ended up with, except for the 60 cigarettes a day.
You got to London, and what happened?
I was at the Polytechnic of Central London, which is on Ridinghouse Street, very close to where we are now. And my lecturer, David Cardiff, I started writing for the college magazine, McGarrel. And my lecturer, David Cardiff, who died young, very sadly, he was married to Lynn Barber, the great journalist. So we were all super impressed with David Cardiff, partly because he was married to Lynn Barber, who was all of our hero. Still is to a great extent, but also he was this very kind of dashing man. And he took me to a cafe and said, "You're the only person who writes for McGarrel who knows how to write."
Gosh.
Yeah, I've never forgotten that. It was the first... I'm not calling my parents like bad parents, but it was the first real moment of sort of kind of affirmation that I ever had, and set me on the course. I thought, well, if David Cardiff thinks that, then I guess this is what I'll do.
And would you have had much idea then of what you wanted to write?
No, I remember I moved to Manchester, and I was walking down the street in Manchester, and this new magazine had just come out called The Sunday Correspondent. And I read the first issue, and I read an article by Luke Jennings, who went on to write that show Eve. Killing Eve.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah,
yes.
He went on to write Killing Eve 20 years later, 30 years later. But I remember this article that he wrote in the Sunday Correspondent, and it was about an official Andrew Lloyd Webber lookalike who wasn't getting much work, because who wants an Andrew Lloyd Webber lookalike? But that's what he looked like, so he had no choice. And then the following week, there was a follow-up article about a friend of his who was talking about how the previous week's article had really gone to this guy's head, and now he thinks he really is Andrew Lloyd Webber. And I remember reading these two articles, and it was like a kind of Damascus moment. Like, this is what I want to do.
Oh, I love that.
I don't know why. I just thought it was just hilarious. This the mix of sort of sadness and human absurdity and the surreality
And
of the whole
psychology.
thing.
That's why human beings do crazy things.
Absolutely,
what is
yeah.
it that leads them into these crazy spaces?
I loved it. And then about a year after that, I had my second Damascus moment, which was watching Nick Broomfield's documentary, The Leader, His Driver and the Driver's Wife, where he took that kind of...
Terre Blanche. It was
Terre Blanche, yeah. And he took that kind of absurdity, but made it about something very important and serious. A neo-Nazi leader in South Africa during the fall of apartheid. But it was just as silly and funny as the Luke Jennings, Andrew Lloyd Webber story.
Yes.
And that's what it really crystallised for me.
And Broomfield works in that he inserts himself into the stories in the way that a lot of documentary makers would consider to be anathema.
Absolutely. I actually interviewed him on stage quite recently in Dublin last summer.
I'd like to have seen that.
I was really good. And I said to him, it's at this wonderful festival called Boris House. Yeah. Can I tell you a story about Boris House once I've told you the story? Yeah, and I said to Nick, there's not many people in the world who can say that they invented a genre.
Yeah.
And everything that, me and Louis Theroux and, we all got it from Nick Broomfield.
Really?
Yeah. He absolutely, because he did it in this very English way. It was very, the great moment of the Terre Blanche documentary is he turns up, he's trying to get an interview with Terre Blanche and most of the documentary is him trying to get this interview, and then he gets the interview and he turns up late for the interview. And he doesn't say this in the documentary, but I later discovered he turned up late deliberately just to see how, which is I would never do that.
That's so bold.
Yeah,
isn't
it? Bold. So Terre Blanche is furious. Yeah. And the camera's on Terre Blanche. It's my favourite 2 minutes of any documentary. The camera's on Terre Blanche the whole time, so you don't see Nick. You just hear him next to the camera. And Terre Blanche is saying, why are you so late? I want to know why. What's so late? Why? And you hear Nick go, we're only 5 minutes late. He goes, I want to know why. Why were you late? And Nick's going, well, we were just 6 or 7 minutes late. He's going, what's more important than me? Why are you so late? And there's this silence and Nick says, we were having tea. and again, I felt like Paul meeting Jesus on the road to Damascus.
This is what I want to do.
This is what I want to do.
Gosh.
Can I tell you my Boris House story?
Absolutely.
Okay, so this is it's my favourite festival in the world. It's this tiny little festival in this big old castle, big house called Boris House near Dublin, about 2 hours outside of Dublin. Anyway, on the last day, I noticed, you'll know this, when somebody books a cab for you, they always book it way too early.
Yes.
Yeah. So I was like at the last night's party and I noticed that the pickup time was 6 a.m. And I thought, well, I'm going to be sitting at Dublin Airport for like 3 hours here. So I spoke to a couple of people and I said, can we move it for 6:30? Now, in fairness to me, I said, and you're definitely going to let the taxi driver know, and you're definitely going to let the other passengers know. And they go, yep, definitely. But this was like the last night party, and everyone was a bit drunk, and everyone was having a good time. And they didn't let the taxi driver know or the other passengers. So I waltzed up at 6:30, going, I'm glad you all got the message. And they all said, we didn't. And the taxi driver was so annoyed with me that for the entire journey, this is like consummate passive aggressiveness. For the entire journey from Boris House to Dublin Airport, he loudly played IRA fighting songs. The whole journey was like, they say the Englishman is the devil. And I'm just like sitting there. That made me laugh so much.
Did Nick Broomfield accept that compliment? Did he accept that he'd created that genre?
Yeah, pretty much. And no, yeah, very much. He's actually kind of given it up now.
Yes, I read.
Yeah, his last few documentaries have been much more traditional. Yes. He made one about Whitney Houston where he's not in it at all, and he made one about, and it's much more like Senna, like Asif Kapadia. Yeah, it's much more like one of his. And then he made a documentary about Leonard Cohen's relationship with Marianne, this sort of love story, of the woman from So Long, Marianne. And again, he's not really in it at all, or not very much.
I don't see your career going that way at this stage, or not.
No, I just want to. I just want to keep Yeah, I see myself as I like, what I really like is like mashing up the genres. So one minute it's me having a ridiculous adventure, then maybe I'll bring in some memoir stuff, then maybe I'll bring in much more like straight investigation, maybe some science or some like strange arcane history. And I love having the confidence to like put all that together in a way that I think a lot of other people wouldn't. Like, people don't like to mix up genres in that way, but I really like it.
Also, they're often not encouraged to, are they? So if you're good at one thing, you're not really supposed to try your arm at another.
Partly because it's very hard to place you in a bookstore.
Yeah.
And you just end up somewhere horrific like Wellness.
Yeah. You get these inspirational moments, these Damascene moments where you think that is actually something I not just could do, but really, really want to do. When did you first allow yourself to think that you were on the road to turning this into a career?
You know, honestly, right at the beginning.
Honestly, even before you'd got anything on the board, you thought, I can. This is what I'm going to do.
Yeah, I had total confidence. I wrote. So I wrote a couple of pieces for the Sunday Correspondent. I wrote to it was Chris Heath, I think, who went on to write a really brilliant book about Robbie Williams called Feel.
Yeah.
I think he was my first commissioner, and they were good. Like I remember my very first piece for the Sunday Correspondent was just a portrait of a very insecure comedian. And I just followed him around for a day, and every time he said something funny, he'd turn to me and say, "Is that funny? Should I use it?" And I just wrote this sort of kind of almost like Michael Lee-ish kind of portrait of this guy. And it was good. And I thought, okay, well, this is the thing I can do.
And it's different though. It's you already, when you describe it like that, you're inserting yourself into his story.
Yeah, pretty much. He's turning to me and he's saying, I'd read Tom Wolfe's New Journalism, so that's got people in it who did that kind of thing. Gay Talese wrote that extraordinary book. It's very dated now, this book called Thy Neighbour's Wife, about sex in America from the 1950s through to the 1980s. It's very male gaze.
Sure.
It's very like Hugh Hefner, everybody loves him, all of that. But it's a kind of extraordinary book too. It ends with Gay Talese completely getting into it and ending up naked on a nudist beach somewhere, waving at a cruise going by. So the idea of like the sort of, and Huntress Thompson did it, of course, in Fear and Loathing, and P.J. O'Rourke. So I always wanted to do it because those were the people I admired.
So where it's now the early 90s and you're in Manchester and you're pitching, I mean, you can't live off a couple of Sunday Correspondent pitches, but you never doubted that this was going to turn into a proper job, a proper career. Well, never a proper job, but a career.
Yeah, I never doubted it. I was completely penniless in Manchester to the extent that we'd go and see the morning movies at the Corner House Cinema, like the press screenings for the free sandwiches we'd get at lunchtime. I don't know how I would have eaten if I wasn't getting the free sandwiches from the Corner House. So that's how broke I was. But I absolutely never doubted it.
You'd infiltrated media circles then. You were getting invited to press screenings.
Only with City. That was because of City Life, which was Manchester's Time Out.
Yes.
Me, Mark Commode was there at the same time. He came up in City Life at the same time. I mean, anybody could work for City Life. You just had to walk in and you could work for them. So.
And you're writing for Buttons.
Oh yeah, nothing. I don't think I got paid at all. If I was paid anything, it was like 40,
sandwiches. You paid in sandwiches. I missed the corner. That was a wonderful cinema, the Corner House,
really
wasn't it? Someone put up the Blue Velvet when David Lynch died. Someone found the picture of when Blue Velvet was on there, and it just I don't know. I spent roughly around the same time I spent a year there, and it just threw me that. Took me back so many memories. And then radio as well was kicking off at around the same time. You're doing a little bit of radio.
Yeah, so for some reason, I can't quite remember how, but I got to know Terry Christian, and he was presenting a show on KFM in Stockport, which is just this little indie station that was very much set up to play like mostly Manchester music. So when the Stone Roses and all of that happened, KFM became quite pivotal to all of that. And Terry had me on as his kind of sidekick. And then when he left to do the words, I got offered his job. And it was me, Craig Cash and Caroline Aherne at 7 o'clock at night to 1 in the morning on this radio station every night. I mean, imagine that.
Have you got tapes?
There are tapes. I've got
somewhere.
Yeah. When they did the big Caroline Aherne special at Christmas, there was,
which was a beautiful film.
I thought they did a wonderful. Yeah. Craig is just brilliant.
Yeah.
One of my first sort of heroes, Craig Cash.
I can see why.
Yeah, and it was extraordinary being with these two.
Because you just stumbled into it.
Yeah.
And of course, they weren't Craig Cash and Caroline Aherne then, except on their passports. But you knew you were in the presence of something very special, and probably they did too.
Yeah, I think so too. I think they both knew they were really talented. I mean, you could tell back then that it was, the progression from them presenting on KFM, going into Mrs. Merton, and then going into the royal family felt like a very natural progression. It didn't. None of it surprised me.
And so again, you've stumbled into this extraordinary. It's a bit like Forrest Gump.
It is a little, because I was there for that, and then Manchester happened, and I was at all the big Manchester shows. Yeah. Spike Island with the Stone Roses. And then when I left Manchester and moved back to London, that's exactly when Britpop happened. Yeah. And I remember, this is very name-droppy, but it's, I get to tell, I've never told the story, I don't think. I was round at Alex from Blur's flat above...
In Covent Garden, down in Seven Dials.
Yes. It was above a bar called Freud's, that's like a wine bar. Yeah. And I'm there, and Alex says, you got to hear the song we recorded today. I've got a cassette. So he puts the cassette in, and it's Parklife.
Oh, amazing.
So I heard Parklife the day it was recorded.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
So you're in London doing the same sort of thing. You start writing for Time Out rather than City Life. You get your column in The Guardian around this time?
Yeah. I got my Time Out job because I was very lucky. We all got fired from KFM. Me, Craig, Caroline, we all got fired. I know. I hope
Who by?
John Eppington, the programme controller.
Just what happened to him?
Well, actually, he died.
Oh, Lord.
Yeah.
Oh, imagine listening. Imagine those three voices and thinking, nah, this isn't what we want. And then spending presumably a few years watching you all go into orbit. And thinking,
I hope so, yeah.
Rob Brydon, again, recently here just before Christmas, has an identical story about being in Cardiff on the radio BBC.
Right.
Well, Cardiff, BBC Wales in Cardiff, and getting let go, and he thought he was destined for absolute greatness, and of course he was.
Yeah, it was so depressing for me because I loved doing that radio show. I loved it. I sometimes think I'd still be there if I'd never been fired. 10 o'clock at night.
I was going to ask that actually.
Yeah.
If it fed your appetites, but you wouldn't want to. You'd always want to be on air with someone else. You'd want to be bouncing and
no. By the end, I mean, me and Craig did quite a lot of co-presenting, but I did a lot on my own as well, and I was sort of bouncing off the listeners phoning in.
Yes, of course.
There was this lady called Mrs. Hutchinson, Mrs. H, and she was very much an influence for the creation of Mrs. Merton. Right. Craig was such a lovely man. Like Mrs. H was probably 80 years old, and she was a widow. And Craig would make us go round there just to her house. She was just a listener. And Craig would make us go round there to entertain her so she wouldn't feel so alone. So we'd go to Mrs. Hutchinson's house. And then I'd see Mrs. Hutchinson in the audience at the Mrs. Merton show on TV.
Really?
Yeah, and I'm sure Mrs. Merton was partly inspired by Mrs. Hutchinson. But then we all got fired. And for some reason, that news reached Time Out in London. And because there was quite a big reinstate Craig and John and Caroline campaign up in Manchester, and somehow Time Out saw that and thought I seemed interesting and offered me the column.
Well, a decent whack then. I mean,
then it was sort of okay money. I wouldn't say amazing.
No, but still, enough to keep your parsnips buttered. Was there never any temptation or prospect of you getting involved in the creative process with Caroline and Craig?
No, I was always a sort of southern outsider to an extent. Yeah. You know what Manchester's like. They don't like us.
No, they do, but they like not liking us.
Yeah, they don't fully accept us. It's not a full acceptance. So I think, Craig and Caroline grew up in such a similar way, working class, northern, homes, very much like that, the homes in the royal family. And I was a middle class, I was Welsh, but I was effectively English. Sure. So I just don't think I would ever have been part of that world.
And have you got goals in mind at this point? Because, this kind of rather lovely shuttling from post to post and pleasurable professional experience to pleasurable professional experience. But this is alongside that sense that you had from the beginning of wanting to make the kind of stuff you ended up making. You're not treading water, but are you doing anything to try to make the bigger stuff happen.
Yeah, I think actually Things Fell Apart, the show I make for the BBC, I think feels like a sort of step forward. It's more thoughtful. It's more about sort of state of the nation, I suppose. So it's still doing these absurd stories and, weird history or whatever. It's still what I do, but feels much more like this is the world in this moment. So I feel there's like maybe a sort of greater intelligence to Things Fell Apart than it has been in some of my previous stuff, and so that's given me the confidence to try and keep doing that, keep telling these stories that have real resonance about this is the world in this moment, and I'm going to tell it through this strange story of this person spiraling. So I'm just writing a new book now. It's almost finished. It'll be out next May, I hope. And I think it's got that. I think it feels like it's a real sort of state of the world, but through these absurd stories.
To rewind again, the first move in that direction was the Ronson mission, was it?
Yeah.
How did that happen?
That was on the back of my Time Out column.
Yeah. So it's happening again, isn't it? You've got quite a charmed early career.
Yeah.
Do you feel that? Is that fair? 'Cause
it really is. I had a few champions,
yes.
and I didn't see it. I did see it in myself, and I didn't see it in myself.
Yes.
But Janet Street Porter, who is the head of youth TV at the BBC, read my columns and thought I could make a TV show based on it. And it was a kind of prank type series called The Ronson Mission. It was pretty bad.
Was it?
Yes. I hadn't quite figured out how to do it just yet. But it did have some very good moments. I wrote a charity, a sort of celebrity charity song called Let's Stamp Out Crime by Any Means Necessary. And we got all of these actors, we got all of these soap stars and Nicholas Parsons and people to take part in this. They thought it was a real thing. And it was this vicious song about, they're not like you and me. There's a lot of bad people about. Let's stamp out crime by any means necessary. It was brutal. I know, you've got Samantha Fox and people are singing along to it. People from Brookside who later on all said they wanted to kill me if they saw me again. So it had its moments. This is where my Louis Theroux sort of comparisons come in, because Louis was one of the few people who watched it who had a similar experience that I had watching Nick Broomfield.
Right.
It was like, this is what I want to do, Louis thought when he watched the Ronson Mission.
He's told you that subsequently.
And
you can see why, can't you? Also Chris Morris probably got a bit inspired by that, didn't he? Elements of it.
To be honest, I doubt it, because
Really?
I think Chris Morris did it so much better than I did. I can't imagine he would ever... Because Louis was more into the sort of, journeying with people aspect of it than the prank aspect. It did very badly, even though some of the scenes like that were very funny. It basically did badly, and but luckily one of the viewers was this guy called Peter Grimsdale, who was a commissioning editor at Channel 4, and he liked it, so he offered me some documentaries at Channel 4. So that's how but there was a moment after the Ronson Mission came out. I remember saying to my wife, God, I've been married to her a long time. I was still with her when that came out. I remember saying to her, this is over. This show's done really badly.
Right.
I think I've hit a wall here. I don't know what I'm going to do. And there was one, there was one line, one lifeline, and it was Peter Grimsdale,
who saw something
and asked me to make documentaries for Channel 4.
And that's when things took off.
Yeah, that's when everything just became plain sailing.
Crazy. So Janet Street Porter saw something in your Time Out articles after Time Out had seen something in
our radio show,
petitions at KFM or on the radio show, and it's all it takes, isn't it? It's, and you clearly had a sense of being an apprentice and being allowed to learn on the job. But
I started so young.
Yes.
The first. I don't think. I started writing professionally, I guess, when I was 18 or 19. And I don't think I can stand behind anything that I did until I was about 30.
And what was that?
That was Them, really, my book Them. And Tottenham Ayatollah, the documentary that I made for Channel 4.
Again, very prescient. Incredibly prescient, actually, thinking about it.
About the rise of militant Islamism in London.
Because what you chronicle curiosities, and then they become quite mainstream. Or then they cease to be curiosities and become... current?
I suppose I'm good at like if I'm curious about something, then and I get really excited about wanting to learn more. I suppose I know a good story when I see it.
Yeah, clearly.
So
And the rest.
yeah, and I think that other people will then be if I'm this interested, other people will be too. Is what I'm thinking.
And so to focus on that, because there aren't clear themes that run through everything you've done. The men who stare at goats is a bit of an outlier in a way, but we're talking about ideology and activism.
Yeah,
marrying each other, aren't we? A lot of the time.
Yeah. Well, I'm sort of against. I feel there's great polemicists like you.
Thank you.
who are very good at being, everybody knows what your point of view is, and you do it on your radio show. So I'm not what I'm about to say isn't throwing shade at all.
Of course,
of people like who do what you do, but I always think that if you're a journalist doing the kind of stories that I do, but you're being led by ideology or activism, then sometimes it can be very positive, like the Me Too reporting and so on, Black Lives Matter reporting. So again, I'm not criticising. But I think when you're led by ideology or led by activism, then there's no room for curiosity. There's no room for humanism. When I was in Australia quite recently and I was on the phone to a journalist who works actually for a centre-right publication in America.
Yeah.
And he said to me that his editor had said to him that the purpose of journalism is to provide moral clarity.
Wow.
And I said, when my friend told me this, I said, that's the worst thing I've ever heard. Because what they're basically saying is the purpose of journalism is to be ideological.
Yes.
And it isn't. That's the purpose of activism. The purpose of journalism is to provide objective, evidence-based curiosity.
Of course.
Yeah.
I'd probably lean closer to the journalist you were on the phone to on some days, but then on other days, I'd understand why you believe what you believe. And of course, if you didn't believe what you believe, you wouldn't be able to spend time with people who are almost objectively repellent.
Yeah, and I'm not saying you shouldn't do ideological journalism.
No, there's room for both.
Yeah,
but you couldn't do what you do if you held a strong.
Exactly. There has to be a world in which all of these different types of journalism kind of coexist.
Yeah.
And what worried me, I don't want to sound too Piers Morgan here, but what worried me slightly.
I think we're probably all right.
Okay. Well, I was slightly worried in the past that ideological activist journalism became so fashionable that the kind of journalism that I do started to be considered weak.
Complicity.
Yeah, complicity,
right.
Exactly.
Okay.
And weak or so there was a little while back then when I thought, am I still going to be allowed to do this kind of journalism?
Of course.
And doors did close. I can't lie. Yeah.
Really?
So I won't say who, but there were certain people I worked for who I kind of wasn't welcome anymore because I wasn't.
Because you don't bring value judgments to your.
Basically,
you leave the viewer to arrive at.
Yeah.
But they didn't feel that the presenter should be neutral in that way.
Yes, exactly. And I think we're past that now.
Yes.
But I think there was a moment around 2017, 2018 when that became a little bit too much the way that journalism was going for my likings. But as I said, this isn't so what I do, I'm not saying that people shouldn't do whatever they want to do, but I think people shouldn't stop people like me from doing what we want to do either, is it?
No, exactly.
Yeah.
And that is, I think it was Danny Wallace, actually, who also did Alex Jones, was also sitting there not long ago. And people like me need reminding sometimes that in order to understand why people like that can generate huge followings, you have to try to understand people like that. The Channel 4 commissions come in. You presumably were you given relative autonomy on choosing what you were going to investigate? And so again, quite lucky at such an early stage to be given that kind of freedom.
Peter Grimsdale was a very big champion of me. I just remembered he got at one point. He's fine now, as far as I know. But at one point he had a surgery. I think he had cancer, and I just remember him telling me that when a Channel 4 commissioning editor has cancer, you discover that when you wake up from your operation, the hospital room is like Beyonce's wedding. The number of flowers that are in there from all your pals at Global Communications.
That's nice.
Yeah, but Peter really championed me, and I did Tottenham Ayatollah with him, and I did this documentary called New Klan about a politically correct faction of the Ku Klux Klan. And Dr. Paisley, I presume, I think, was with him. And so all of those things then turned into my first book then.
Yes. And at that point, you became Jon Ronson, really.
It was when Them came out.
Yes.
I think Tottenham Atoller really helped. That was a successful, and it won an award. And but then when Them came out, I remember doing a talk in Oxford Street, pretty much the first talk I did for them. And the room was just packed.
Yeah. What was that like? Were you surprised? Did
Yeah,
you
I was. So there was it was absolutely packed. I brought out this documentary at the same time called Secret Rulers of the World, and that's why I got chased by the Bilderberg Group, and I tried to sneak into Bohemian Grove with Alex Jones, and I knew actually when I was doing all of that stuff,
this is magic.
Yeah, this is magic, especially sneaking into Bohemian Grove with Alex Jones.
Of course.
I remember that was incredible, getting all the secret footage of this weird ceremony that all these world leaders do on a Saturday night at this campsite in the redwood forests of Northern California. I mean, my God.
How surprised have you been by his journey?
Very.
Yeah.
I always knew that he would become a big star in the conspiracy world.
Right.
That I had no doubt about that. He was him and to a slightly lesser extent David Icke, but still David Icke are good at it. Like they're good, they're entertaining. People want to listen to them. And before they came along, all the conspiracy talk show hosts were so boring. Sitting in these public access, rooms, just so dull, these dull old men. So when Alex came along, there was no doubt that he'd be huge. But having the ear of Trump and all of that was a total surprise to me.
Yeah.
I remember I was at the gym in the Upper West Side in New York, and I was watching a Trump press conference very early on in his first campaign, and somebody shouted out, "Are you going to go back on the Alex Jones show?" And Trump goes, "Alex Jones, nice guy." And honestly, I nearly fell off the elliptical.
Wow. Yeah.
I thought I just couldn't believe that Alex was becoming that well known.
And it hasn't really finished for him, has it? Despite the bankruptcies and the legal action and the stuff like that. Are you the least surprised? I mean, surprised by his personal trajectory, but by the way in which conspiracies have moved in to the mainstream, by the way in which you now have television channels here, not just in the States, that are... Vaccines were a big moment, weren't they, in this process?
Vaccines were a very big moment. The first time I really noticed it, I guess, was the Iraq War, actually.
Yeah.
It's when, our leaders aren't always great. The way we got into the war in Iraq wasn't perfect. I personally had no problem at all with lockdown and the vaccines. I was all for it, but at the same time, I understand why it changed people's relationship with power. So I really do get it.
And with truth.
Yeah, and with truth. Yeah, I mean, people look at Fauci. I get a little bit annoyed. Maybe I'm wrong what I'm about to say, but at the beginning of lockdown, Fauci was saying don't wear masks, and then he said wear masks. And in America, there's a lot of people who are like, that's a kind of gotcha. Oh, for me, it's like that's just human. It's a mess. We don't know what's going on.
It's a new thing. I mean, our understanding of it is evolving all the time.
Yeah, exactly. So I think the people who believe that kind of stuff about Fauci are wrong because they're not taking into account. They see everything as conspiratorial when in fact it's probably just a mess at the beginning.
Can anyone fall down these holes? Or
yes.
Absolutely anyone.
Yeah. And I think, I did a little bit in the first Trump presidency. I watched CNN every night. I used to joke that Anderson Cooper was like my Q, and CNN was my QAnon. I believed everything. So when the Mueller report was about to come out, I was so excited. Like this was the end of Trump. He was going to be taken out of the White House in handcuffs, and it never happened. And maybe that was my version of falling down.
It's not quite the same, is it?
It's not quite the same, but I got too obsessed with Trump the first time around. I've got friends who have... And I'm not making any value judgments on the ideology here, but I've got friends who've absolutely lost themselves to Israel Gaza. When I say lost themselves, I mean, they've utterly changed their lives because of it. I've got friends who have dumped their friends who they think don't have the same ideology as them. And that gets into a slightly culty type world.
Yes, it does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It does. So, yeah, because, again, that moral clarity line leads you to think that the causes you approve of don't have any of the trappings of cultishness, or causes you approve of don't speak to the same psychological susceptibility for zero sum, for all or nothing, or you're either with me or against me. Whereas the whole point of your work, as we've touched on quite a lot, is to try to find interesting things about everyone that you
and
examine.
to just have a sort of balanced, some kind of a balanced life. I was listening, there's a very good podcast called Decoding the Gurus, which I listened to. And they would say the other day about how they were talking about this very thing and how when you join a cult, one of the things you do when you join a cult is you give up your family and friends.
Yes, of course.
Who don't have the ideological purity.
Yes, of course.
And they said on this podcast that they're seeing this more and more with people who aren't joining cults. They've just got so involved in an ideology. It could be gender critical feminism. It could be Gaza. It doesn't, I say I'm not casting judgments on
I hear what you're saying.
the thing.
It just becomes defining.
Yeah.
All defining.
Yes, exactly.
Gosh.
Yeah.
You're going on the road with the Psychopath revisit, the retread at the end of this year. I don't think you need any help from me selling tickets, but I am interested in...
I need your help in Aylesbury and Stoke.
There we go.
Every time I do a tour, a town becomes my enemy. The last time around, my enemies were Southend and Ipswich, and my hand to God, they turned out to be two of the best shows on the whole tour.
Oh, perfect.
Very busy and fantastic. So that's actually why I wanted to do another leg. Because those more slightly out of the way places turned out to be the most fun shows.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, so this time around I'm doing mostly more out of the way places.
Love it. So Aylesbury and Stoke, this is your call to arms for next November.
Absolutely, be less indifferent to me and
how
Psychopaths.
dare you? So it's fane.co.uk/Jon-Ronson. But what is it? I mean, because the book is, by the time you're on the road, it's nearly 15 years old. Yeah.
Well, it's a proper show with a proper arc of mystery guests who are so good, I can't even tell you. If this is why I want to do one more leg of this show, because my mystery guests are so amazing.
Wow.
And I just introduced them as, by their first name, so the audience has no idea what's going to happen in the story. But with both of them, by the end of the stories, people are like the gasps that are coming from the audience. That's why I'm going back on the road to do it one more time, because of the gasps that come from my mystery guest stories. And I've got film clips. In short, the first half of the show is teaching people how to spot psychopaths, and the second half of the show is making people feel guilty about their new psychopath spotting skills. So that's basically the show. But people do seem to really like it. And that's why I'm doing like another sort of 15 or so in November.
It's still a journey through the madness industry.
Yeah. To the extent that it's about the ups and downs of mental health labelling as well as psychopathy.
Well, we began by me
talking a bit about that.
Crediting you with spotting something I hadn't spotted about this reverse in baggage almost.
Yeah. I mean, where you see it in a huge way, and I personally think it's a little controversial, but I feel very positive about it, is autism.
Yeah.
Personally, there's people out there who say, oh, it's ridiculous to, call all of these, for all of these people to be called autistic when they're living completely functional lives. But I think those people are wrong.
Yes, and that's the point.
I think they're wrong. I think that we've grown up so used to think of autistic people as being these kind of very locked in people. But in fact, there's a lot of people out there who are autistic and don't even realise it.
For sure.
And so there's an example of sort of greater awareness of a mental health diagnosis that's had very, I think, positive impact.
And not just autism, but even, I think...
ADHD is another one.
Well, Amanda, she's in the paper today talking about a late life ADHD diagnosis.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
How it's meant he no longer lives on adrenaline. He no longer he understands himself better and he does things better. But that way,
very important. So I'd say there's negatives too, and I'm critical. In fact, one of my episodes of Things Fell Apart is critical of the increase of trauma as a diagnosis. But so that I think there's times when the sort of widening or the greater the greater understanding can have negative impacts. But I think by and large, it's very positive.
Yes.
And ADHD and autism are two very good examples of it being positive.
And it liberates people. We do take calls on the radio show. Particularly, I'll tell you what happens a lot is a child gets a diagnosis and the parent, often the dad, usually the dad, but not always, suddenly realises that they've been living with it for 40 years.
Right.
And so their kid gets a diagnosis after 10 years and they suddenly go, well, that's me as well. And they then find it has life-changing qualities.
Absolutely. And it can be little things like you really don't want to go to this dinner party tonight. You're not some sort of freak.
Yes.
There's a reason for it.
There's a reason for it.
Yeah.
We're nearly done. You've got the new book coming out in May of next year. Come on the radio show and talk about that.
I'd love to.
When you can.
Yeah. And then I've got this epilogue episode of The Debutante's going to be coming out pretty soon. And I'm going to make a third season of Things Fell Apart for the BBC.
Fantastic.
And
so you're busy.
Yeah, that's basically it, though.
Okay, but you haven't got another big one in embryonic form. You haven't got another mission that you'll think. Have you got that feeling yet? What's the thought you wrote down that has actually?
Well, actually, for season 3 of Things Fell Apart,
there's a few.
There's a little one. Yeah, I'm sort of interested in. I was very interested in, like everybody, in Luigi Mangione. And again, that thing about, the individual versus the institution, kind of class war. I suppose what I'm thinking about for the third season of Things Fell Apart is maybe culture wars are slightly on the wane.
Yes.
And maybe what's happening instead is class war. And so maybe season 3 of Things Fell Apart, if I can find the stories, will be about class war.
I have a conspiracy theory.
Go on.
That it was precisely because the Occupy Wall Street movement was beginning to frighten people that they launched the culture wars in the first place.
I mean, right. They certainly love us scrabbling around down here. I mean, just, think about Elon Musk as our kind of puppet master, making us all angry down here.
About silly things with each other.
About
instead of
nonsense.
Looking up. Instead of, there you go. That's the closest I've ever come to a conspiracy theory.
No, I feel the same way.
It's pendulous, isn't it? So it could now swing back. I don't know if you've ever had ambitions in the formal sense, John, really, in terms of things that you want to do as opposed to things that you want to get made.
No, not really. We live a pretty... I've got everything I want.
Yes.
And it's funny at this age to finally be able to say that. We've got a little flat in Greenwich Village, little one-bedroom flat in Greenwich Village. We've got a lovely little farmhouse in upstate. I come back to London whenever I want to.
Yeah.
And there's nothing else in life that I want.
Content.
I am content. I get to tell the stories that I want to do. And honestly, that's it. There's nothing else. I see my son whenever he wants. I've got a very good relationship with my wife and son. When I come back to London, I see my friends. That's what else do you want?
What else do you want? Yeah. Jon Ronson, thank you.
Thank you, James.